land is the basis of all independence.
Hello, this is Dr. B's Revolution Will Not Be Pesticides, and today's video we're going to talk about the rise and fall of West African empires and the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Alright, so to understand this, we have to first talk about West Africa, what it consisted of. Now, there is, like I said before in previous videos, West Africa is a very diverse continent, very diverse peoples, but around this time period we're talking about during the Middle Ages, roughly between the years 400 and 800, there was a state that was starting to formulate as a stronger and stronger state that was going to be classified as an empire by the year 800. And this was the Empire of Ghana, also known as Ouagadougou. Okay, the Empire of Ghana, Empire of Ouagadougou. Now, in order to understand this, you also have to go back to understand some of the societies that existed prior to this time, even going as far back as 250 BC. There was the Gene Society. The Gene Society was a society in which it was very highly populated. Archaeologists have come to the conclusion that this society, which exists in the Sahelian region, was able to burgeon because of extensive trade and some of these things. But also one of the reasons why societies were able to become successfully large and centralized and so-called civilized at this time period was because they sat on a field or in an area where there was iron ore beneath the ground. And these were West African peoples that started smelting iron as far back as 250 BC. Alright, now you have other parts of West Africa like the Igbo people in southeast Nigeria that started smelting iron as far back as the year 2000 BC. And we'll get into that in another video. But there's evidence to suggest that in this part, in the Sahelian region, what's present-day Mali, that people were smelting iron as far back as at least 250 BC, and then also coming up with all these different types of artifacts as a result. Now, if you, one of the reasons why you start to see centralized states popping up right around West Africa during this time period is for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because if you look at the Sahelian region and where it's located, at that parallel, it's not too far deep into the south to where it's nothing but a dense forest, and it's not too far north to where it's very arid desert. Right there in the middle there, it's like the perfect region to where it's not too dry and it's also not too extremely wet. So one of the things is this: when you go too far deep into the south, into the dense forest, it's kind of hard to set up a society where, based on agriculture and those kinds of things. It's even hard to establish a society based on the domestication of animals because of the fact that when you go too far south into West Africa there, you have what they call the tsetse fly. Now the tsetse fly will kill your cattle. It will kill your livestock. And then when you go too far north, for obvious reasons, it's dry there as well, and this is where you're more likely to find nomadic or semi-nomadic societies. But right there in the Sahelian region, it's perfect conditions in order to set up a more sedentary society. Not only that, because there was iron ore beneath the surface in the Sahelian region, people were also be able to use their ingenuity and start coming up with tools and things like that that would enable them to establish tools for the farming, to establish more of a sedentary society. Because once you start to see agriculture being practiced in certain areas, you start to see populations start to become more settled and less nomadic. As a result of that, you start to see population boom, and then you start to see the stratification of society to a certain degree, and then you start to see organization, right? What we know as civilization, organization. Not only that, because the climate was not too densely forested, full of the tsetse fly in the south, as it was in the south, and because it wasn't so dry as it was in the north, horses can survive very well at this latitude line as well. So you also had the people who were able to use cavalry, right, in warfare and conquest and things like that. So it became a perfect setup at this time. So as time goes on, as a result of the perfect climate, as a result of iron ore being beneath the surface, as a result of being able to use cavalry, horses, in conquest and warfare, you start to see a more sedentary established society being established in this area here. Gene Geno was a part of this come up. And eventually you would have Ghana, which was an empire that existed from roughly, like I said before, 800 to roughly 1200 AD. But the Empire of Ghana, not only did they have iron ore beneath the surface, but they also had gold. All right, there was a gold field known as Galam that the people of Ghana, the Soninke people, actually harbored. Now, they were able to use this gold to sustain a certain degree of elaborate trade for a very long time. Because remember, gold was one of those metals, one of those resources that was coveted by people all over the world for one reason or another. But then, as time went on, the gold fields of Galam started to become exhausted. And not only that, but you also had an invasion from the north in the year 1076 by the Almoravids. Now, the Almoravids had invaded Ghana, and that kind of also led to its demise as well. So a couple of things kind of led to a weakened Ghana. But then the Malinke people, or the Mandinka people, who lived next door to the Soninke people, both being Mande groups, but the Mandinka being somewhat slightly different, they harbored gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, right, which were a little bit to the southeast of the gold fields of Galam. Now, with these new gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, the Mandinka people were able to do as the people of Ghana were doing, and they were able to thrive on this new extensive trade. The Mandinka, or the Mali society, was founded by Sondiata Keita. Right, he goes all the way back to the 1230s. Okay, now right around the year 1235, the Mali Empire, even though it was an empire, one of the important things to note about the Mali Empire is that it had certain characteristics that were akin to more of a democratic type of system, a democratic type of society. And here's what I mean by that. First of all, they had what they call the Mandan Charter, also known as the Kurukan Fuga. Now, the Kurukan Fuga was basically like a human rights document, oral document, kind of like the Magna Carta. So, and this was right around the time of the Magna Carta as well, in the 1200s. And sometimes the Africans aren't given credit for their human rights record, but if you go back and you see the oral histories and things like that, you can actually find some of these things. And now the Kurukan Fuga actually had a number of articles. There were 44 articles of the Kurukan Fuga, and it consisted of things like, there was a section, 1 through 30 consisted of, talked about social organization, how you organize society. Articles 31 through 36 talked about the importance of property rights. Articles 37 through 39 talked about environmental protection. And Articles 40 through 44 talked about personal responsibilities. And just some of the articles consisted of things like this. For instance, you had Article 5 says everyone has a right to life and to the preservation of physical integrity. Accordingly, any attempt to deprive one's fellow being of life is punished with death. Okay? So even though it had some human rights with it, you can see that, they were serious about laying down the law for those who were trying to deprive others of life. There was also Article 9, where it says children's education behooves the entire society. A paternal authority, in consequence, falls to everyone. Okay? Article 13 says never offend women who are our mothers. Okay? Never offend these people. Very important. Article 20, as we talked about in the previous video, these types of societies had slavery or had systems that were akin to slavery. As Josephine Corey had pointed out, these societies didn't necessarily have slaves, but something more akin to serfdom, as during feudalism. But this has been translated to state that Article 20, do not ill-treat your slaves, or do not ill-treat your servants. Okay, so this is another important aspect of it. Article 32 of the Kurukan Fuga of the Mali Empire states there are 5 ways to acquire property: buying, donation, exchange, work, and inheriting. Any other form without convincing testimony is doubtful. Okay. Article 33, any object found without a known owner becomes common property only after 4 years. Article 38 states that before setting fire to the bush, don't look down at the ground. Raise your head in the direction of the top of the trees to see whether they bear fruits or flowers. So it's very important. You don't want to destroy any type of tree, right, that's going to bear fruit or flower. It's very important because you need to make sure that you're feeding people, and you don't want to make sure you're ruining the environment in that sense. Article 40 states that respect kinship, marriage, and the neighborhood. And these are some of the things that were very important to the Malian society. In addition to that, the structure of the Mali society was set up to where you had different levels of this thing, right? So, for instance, you had on the local level or on the village level, the leaders were elected, all right, usually elected leaders who were part of the founding bloodline, right, and that was on the local level. On the county level in the Mali Empire, so it was a very like confederated type of system, kind of like in other parts of West Africa. On the county level, leaders were appointed by governors who were inside the circle from the province level. So people at the province level appointed governor leaders. And then on the province/state level, whichever one you want to call it, provinces picked their own governors through elections or inheritance. Okay, so it's kind of a mixed type of system, and depending upon the locality of the system itself. So it wasn't like every single state had to work in unison, or every single village had to work in unison. Each village had their own way of doing their own thing, and the farther away from the state you were, the more likely you were to have that certain degree of freedom. All right, the farther away you were from the capital of Mali, the more likely you were to exercise your freedom and independence. So if you're looking at the Mali Empire, they say that the reason why the Mali Empire was able to sustain itself so well for so long and for such a vast territory is because they allowed for their people to exercise their freedoms in the local villages, especially the more distant they were from the capital. Okay, and then if you go all the way to the top levels, the governors had to be approved by the Mansa. All right, by the Mansa, and so this is an example of the more centralized or the higher up you go, the more controlled it is. But on the very local levels, the more decentralized it is. All right, so that's also very important to keep in mind as well. Now, but the Mali Empire really didn't start to get recognition until a couple things happened. There was a guy by the name of Abubakar II, who was the Mansa at the time. In the year 1311, Abubakar II decided he wanted to explore. So Abubakar II, with a fleet of several ships, decided to go on a journey in the year 1311, and he left. He gave up his throne and he left Africa for the Americas. And there's a book by Ivan van Sertima called "They Came Before the Columbus," and in this book, Ivan van Sertima argues that Africans had arrived in the Americas before Christopher Columbus, almost 200 years before Christopher Columbus. And one of the evidences of that is the fact that Abubakar II had left, and he brought a lot of gold with him, because remember, Mali has a lot of gold. And they said when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they found what they termed to be Guinea gold in the Americas. So this was an example of this. But then when Abubakar II gave up his throne, guess who ended up taking over? It was a guy by the name of Mansa Musa. Now, Mansa Musa, he was an individual who really wanted, by the year 1312 when he took over, he really wanted to put Mali on the map. Like literally wanted to put it on the map. Mansa Musa was also considered the richest man who ever lived, worth $400 billion. We have all this gold. We know that everybody's coveting this gold. So he decided when he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca between the years 1324 and 1327 that he's actually going to bring a whole lot of assistance with him, a whole lot of people with him, in order to let the world know about this gold. So Mansa Musa decides he ends up bringing 100 camels. He brings 60,000 individuals with him. Each camel is holding 300 pounds of gold dust. He has 500 slaves, each brandishing 6-pound gold staffs. He ended up giving 50,000 gold dinars to Egypt's sultan. On the way to Mecca, Mansa Musa decided, according to myth, that he was going to build a mosque every Friday where he went. Mansa Musa was giving out gold. He was tossing it out there. He was giving out, showing it off, letting the world know that he's about that life. And he's giving out so much gold that when he passed through Cairo, Egypt, he gave out so much gold and spent so much money in that town that he caused a recession in that city. And that city wasn't able to recover for another 20 years. But as Mansa Musa did this, and he's passing out so much gold, people couldn't believe where all this gold was coming from, because everybody wanted gold. Gold was coveted by everybody. So Mansa Musa is like attracting all this attention. And to some people it was unwanted attention, but to Mansa Musa this is exactly what he wanted. So you had scholars, you had learned people, you had mathematicians, you had architects, you had all kinds of people, merchants, all following Mansa Musa back to Mali. And what do? They all start investing in Mali and start investing in creating and building. And so it was under Mansa Musa's watch you start to see the construction of these great towns and these great education centers. Like for instance, you have Timbuktu starts to be constructed and established. Timbuktu is one of those locations that you end up seeing large establishments, large structures, large architectural structures, etc. being established. Now in Timbuktu was one of those places that you start to see attracting a lot of attention. Everybody's going to Timbuktu, and they help in constructing what they call the University of Timbuktu. And the University of Timbuktu consisted of the school of Sankore, the school of Jingereber, and also the school of Sidi Yahya. Now, though they brought these outside experts in the construction of Timbuktu, places like the University of Timbuktu and the school of Sankore, they actually syncretize indigenous practices with the Islamic practices. For instance, the Africans, the indigenous sub-Saharan Africans, actually place a lot of importance in ancestral worship and ancestral acknowledgement. And so you couldn't just bring in supplies and things like that from the outside and expect there to be some type of ancestral presence while you're in your place of worship. There were places known as the Musalla, where Muslims went to worship and pray. These places, the Africans wanted to make sure that they used the actual earth, they used the actual dirt from where they lived, from where their ancestors were born, raised, and died, to construct the Musalla. You cannot construct the Musalla without using the earth from where they were born, lived, and died. All right. So if you look at some of these pillars, you can look at some of the construction of the buildings, like the University of Timbuktu and the Mosque of Jenne. They used local earth to construct these things. All right. You might look at it and say, "Oh, this looks like a sandcastle or mud hut." No, this was done intentionally. It was done intentionally to make sure that the places that they worshipped had the energy, had the spiritual energy flowing through these locations. All right, so this was very important. You just didn't want to import material from the outside that has no direct spiritual or energy type connection to the location where the ancestors actually resided. All right, so that's also very important. There was also, in addition to these three schools that comprised of the University of Timbuktu, there was 150 Islamic schools found all throughout the Mali Empire. In addition to that, their library contained between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. The Mali Empire was a place where people from all over the world were going there to learn. And people from all over the world were going there to contribute to the education. Education was so important. With the Kudukan Fuga, education was so important amongst the Mandinka people in Mali, and education was so important then, and education should still be so important now. And Mansa Musa had become so popular and the Mali Empire becomes so popular that the outside world everybody had known about this place. It had become so popular that the Spanish cartographer in the year 1375 named Abraham Cresques, when he drew a map of the world and he drew Africa, Africa was depicted as a place, as the land of gold. He drew a black man with a gold staff in his hand, a gold crown on his head, with a gold nugget in his hand. This is how the outside world had viewed Africa at this time. Africa wasn't being depicted as a place of savages, of cannibals, and things like that. It was actually being depicted as a place that was well respected, well revered by the outside world. All right. Now, as time went on and as the Mali Empire continued to get all this attention, one of the things that started to happen was obviously the Europeans and other people are starting to say, hey, well, we want to tap into this gold trade as well. But as you're going to see, in the Mali Empire, they couldn't sustain themselves as gold producers forever, because you only can have so much gold coming out of your coffers. So by the I think it was the late 1300s that you start to see less and less gold coming out, specifically out of the Mali Empire. Bambouk and Bure's gold fields had become depleted. So now the Mali Empire started to depend upon gold coming from the southern regions, the more forested regions of West Africa, where the Akan people are. Now the Akan people are people who are not a centralized society. They're more an anti-state, decentralized type society, kind of transitioning now at this point from a hunter-gatherer phase of society, trying to transition into a more sedentary phase of their development. But because they're so heavily forested in the region that they live, what they need in their society is more labor in order to cut down these trees, in order to establish agricultural settings and farms and things like that. But they can't do it because they don't have the manpower in order to do it. But then there's these group of merchants between Mali and the Akan in the south, known as the Wangara merchants. And the Wangara merchants are able to supply them what it is that they need in Akan country in order for them to get what they need in order to establish a more sedentary society. So the Akan people are now trading gold towards the north in exchange for things like labor or salt, which are heading down south into their coffers. It's a good trade, right? It's a decent trade. And it's been able to sustain itself for a while. But remember, now Mali is now depending upon the outside to sustain itself as the supreme empire. So this kind of makes Mali a little bit vulnerable and a little bit weaker, because now these same Wangara merchants can also be making these deals with the Zarma and the Dendi people who live to the east of Mali, who are now starting to try to compete for supremacy in the Sahelian region against the Mali Empire. So Mali is not really the center anymore of trade. Trade is shifting. And as trade is shifting, Songhai is gaining strength. And as Songhai gains strength, Songhai, by the year 1468, they're able to go in and they're able to conquer Timbuktu, take over Timbuktu. And as Songhai goes in there to take over Timbuktu in 1468, and then another thing happens which also decentralizes trade in the Mali Empire even more, which is the arrival of the Portuguese, because the Portuguese are now sailing along the coast of West Africa. And by the year 1471, when they land on the Akan country Gold Coast there, now the Akan people are like, well, we have a new trading partner to the south. We don't need these trading partners to the north. Especially as time goes on and more trade starts to develop amongst the Portuguese as they establish more ports along the West African coast, along the West Central African coast, along the Southeast African coast, along the Indian coast in Asia, and then even into the Americas. The Akan people are now realizing they have the world at their doorsteps, and there is no reason to continue to trade to the north. So this even decentralizes the Sahelian empires even more. And then it gets to the point where now not only does Timbuktu fall, but Djenné falls. By the year 1477, Djenné falls to Songhai. And then Songhai even becomes weaker with the Moroccan invasion from the north by 1591. But with the fall, the Sahelian empires are falling partially because the center of trade is changing. Trade routes are now changing to the coastal regions of West Africa, which are developing coastal states. And the coastal states are now gaining strength at the expense of the interior states, of the Sahelian states that were once reigning supreme before. Now, these very decentralized groups that were fragmented societies or anti-state societies are now starting to develop as stronger states. And all the ones that want to resist statehood or want to resist large centralized empires, well, they might be able to resist for a while, but a lot of them end up having to succumb to the pressures and the dominance of the predatory states that are starting to develop along the coast as a result of the trade with the Europeans during this time. Now, something else interesting starts to happen. As the trade that's initially coming out of Africa is this: the Portuguese at first are not even really concerned about extracting slaves out of Africa. In fact, when the Portuguese first started to sail around Africa, one of the things they were concerned about is finding a trade route to the east. They knew all these things were coming from the east or from the south or from somewhere else, but they weren't finding it in Europe. They knew that silks were coming from the east, spices were coming from the east, gunpowder was coming from the east, gold, precious metals, palm oil, whatever. And they knew all this stuff was coming from somewhere else. But the Muslims had conquered North Africa and Southern Europe and parts of Asia from between the years 1711 and 1492. And with the conquest that the Muslims had on this area, the Muslims, believe it or not, brought a lot of ingenuity, mathematics, science, astrology, astronomy, all these things into Europe at this time. And so now the Europeans, the Portuguese in particular, now developed the knowledge in order to circumnavigate the ocean. And they also wanted to circumnavigate the caliphate, the Muslim caliphates that were in the north, that were blocking them from a direct trade with the Africans and the gold, and blocking them from a direct trade from the east. So now the Portuguese start to make their way along the west coast of Africa. And they sail to this coast, and then they sail to that coast. And as I explained before, by 1441, they landed in the Upper Guinea region. By 1471, they landed on the Gold Coast. By 1486, by 1482, they landed in the Kingdom of the Congo. By 1486, they established connections in the Benin Kingdom. And they started to establish more and more connections as they went along the west coast of Africa. And then they established connections in India. But then something happens. See, the Akan people were exporting gold in the 1400s, right? In exchange for sometimes guns, sometimes salt, sometimes whatever else it was. The Kingdom of the Congo was exchanging copper between 1483 and 1513. But then once the Portuguese and the Spanish discover America in 1492, 1500, they eventually start to find their own precious metals. And as they start to find their own precious metals, the Portuguese and the Spanish no longer have a dependency on African gold. Because remember, the Portuguese cannot conquer Africa, right? It wasn't feasible. It wasn't something that they can do. But they were able to conquer and take over a lot of land in the Americas. But even though they were able to conquer and take over a lot of land in the Americas, they couldn't really control the labor as much as they wanted to in the Americas. Because remember, the labor, it knows the land. It's kind of hard to enslave the people in their own home. And two, a lot of people were dying off from European diseases. So when the Europeans went back to the Africans and they said, we don't need your gold anymore. We have our own gold in the Americas. At that point, the Africans had become addicted to this trade. Remember, the Portuguese were bringing the world to their doorstep. These Africans who had linked up with the Portuguese, who had made these connections for so many years at this point. Not all the Africans, remember, but the ones that had become addicted to the trade. Now the Portuguese say, we don't need your gold, but we do need one thing. We need your labor. And at this point, the Africans had become so addicted to the trade that they were willing to do whatever it took So they said, well, if you want us to get some labor, we need some of your ammunition. We need some of your weaponry. And then this became the trade. Means of production were exchanged for means of destruction. Men were being exported out of Africa. Guns were being imported into Africa. These guns were being used to conquer other weaker, decentralized groups, villages on the outskirts of the centralized societies, and they were selling the prisoners of these wars to the Europeans while they're incorporating the women and the children to their societies. And these West African polities started to grow and grow and burgeon and larger and larger. But men were getting sold in large quantities. One of the things that the Africans had working against them was that the Native Americans were not immune to European diseases. Europeans were not immune to tropical diseases, but the Africans were immune to European diseases by and large. And the Africans, for the most part, were immune to many of the tropical diseases. So they became the perfect candidate for enslavement at this time period. And in addition to the Native Americans throughout Central and South America dying from European diseases, there was a Spanish priest by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas, who in the early 1500s decided that the Spanish were actually treating the Native Americans very harshly, and he felt that it was wrong to enslave a free people. And he felt like the Native Americans were a free and sovereign people, and they did not deserve to be enslaved in that manner. So Bartolomé de las Casas actually started to petition to either bring in some European laborers or debtors or servants or slaves, or go to Africa and bring in some slaves from Africa. Bartolomé de las Casas did not know that many of the enslaved Africans that were being brought to the Americas were actually a free people. He thought that Africa had a readily available population of slaves. And so after a couple of decades of realizing that they were actually kidnapping free people in Africa as well, Bartolomé de las Casas also changed his mind on the enslavement of Africans as well. But you can see that Bartolomé de las Casas, being a Spanish priest, being one of those figures in society that had a certain degree of importance within the society, he also had a little bit of influence in changing the minds of the people as well in terms of who they were going to enslave throughout Latin America. And then later on, you would start to see that not only the Spanish and the Portuguese would be conducting this transatlantic slave trade, but then the French, the British, the Dutch, and many others would also continue to do the same thing as well. Alright? Now this is where, with this transition, you start to see a rise in the transatlantic slave trade. So between the year 1500 and 1867, 12.5 million people were taken out of Africa. And that's not considering all the people that had died in the process or had died in barracoons waiting to be shipped or anything like that. Or had been taken to North Africa or East Africa. Alright? So that is how the West African empires had risen. This is a brief video how these empires attracted attention by the Europeans, but how the European trade with the Africans had transitioned from a trade with trying to extract precious metals out of Africa to turning into needing the labor out of Africa. Alright? Now remember guys, the revolution will not be pesticides. Peace.
Land is the basis of all independence.